Here, I listened. I want to compliment my colleagues for bringing forward this motion, offering an opportunity for this issue to be debated, despite the fact that I think it's incumbent on government to put forward a special debate in this whole area to address the crisis that exists. I've listened attentively to what the Minister has to say. Some of the points that jump out at me are some of the content of his speech. He talks about the legacy of undersupply. It's his #1 priority. He wants to increase supply. He doesn't want to go back to the boom and bust. Their demand outweighs supply. He's committed to solving the housing issue. He's in the final months of a 5-year term in government, and the root cause is still Fianna Fáil. He's talking about seeking financially stable mechanisms to achieve success. Talks about the long-term 2020 strategy is increased by 1 year today. The real reason for that is there's been no progress in that regard this year at all. He says, he's admitted to 493 new units this year, 2,900 committed. I don't know whether there's permission for them or they're in the process of planning. The other points towards the end of his speech, in relation to homelessness and action that is necessary immediately, he says that he will examine any and all potential solutions. I'll ensure that if changes to the planning and procurement procedures are required, they will be made. This is something that should have been done long ago. You talked in relation to rents. You do agree that something should be done to create rent certainty. As you heard last night, you made that commitment last February. You're making it again tonight, but no action to back that up. You have said, all right, you've made a commitment that you'll do nothing on rent supplements. It's not in your remit, you say, but there's obvious disagreement between you and your partners in coalition, and it's not something that's going to be contemplated by your partners. Therefore, you're not going to risk going to the country too quick when you need longer to see if you can resurrect your fortunes, if you can survive until next March. So, all in all, what that speech is, to somebody looking for real and effective solutions that are required at this time, that is nothing short of gobbledygook. And what you need, in order for this debate to be real and meaningful, and to have some effect and some prospect of solutions, the first thing you need to acknowledge, realise and admit that all your policies, all your programmes, all your initiatives over the last almost 5 years haven't worked. If they were working, would there be 130,000 applicants on the waiting list throughout the country, as compared to you telling the public there's 90,000? We obtained those figures recently that proves there's 130,000 throughout the country applicants. That could well be 300,000 people. There are 1,500 children living in emergency accommodation. Previous speakers have explained that 3 families a day are going into emergency accommodation. 707 families nationally are in emergency accommodation today. If that says nothing else, it says whatever you're doing, it just ain't working. Stop the pretense, admit the failure, respond to this crisis with emergency legislation, with an emergency status that might resurrect your fortunes and might resolve the difficulties that exist. It is the greatest and gravest issue facing all of us for the last 18 months to 2 years. And I lost my temper here with your predecessors, Hogan and O'Sullivan. And I thought that might, spur you into action. We've made suggestions, we've made proposals, I've issued policy documents in the area of housing and home ownership, in rent and rent certainty and all issues surrounding rent. And I don't say I have a monopoly on solutions. I don't say that I have all the answers. But what I am saying is, and what is my duty and obligation as a member of this House and as an opposition spokesperson in this area, to put forward real, credible, constructive alternatives and proposals. Steal them if you want, because that's the job of this forum, for resolutions to be found to solutions based on the issues that exist in our own constituencies collectively, which has formed this perfect storm, as you call it. And we've all heard of perfect storms in the last number of years, whether here 2 years ago or in the States on a regular basis. You know what follows perfect storms? States of emergency. You'll admit to a perfect storm and you talk about all the issues that contrive to create a perfect storm, but you won't bring forward emergency solutions to deal with what the perfect storm left behind. In relation to homelessness, and as I said before, what is lacking in all your responses, what is lacking in all the presentations, in all the speeches and all the commentary you make in relation to this issue is urgency. There is no concept of urgency, visible or otherwise. As I said yesterday, 2,600 homes are vacant. Local authority homes are vacant in this country today. And there's a lot of fanfare down in Houston Station, I believe, about proposals for capital spending over the next 5, 10 or 15 years, I don't know which. 29 billion has been talked about, supplemented by a further 14 billion from semi-state sector. That's great and that's fine and dandy, and that might win an election 2 terms away. But it does very little to address the immediacy of the problem that 2,600 homes are vacant. If you want to do something about this, if you want to live up to the expectation that you gave the rest of us and that Taoiseach gave the rest of us when he said and you said and this government said that money was not an obstacle. Money is no problem in relation to rectifying vacant homes. Well, it most definitely is when I have proved to you that 1.6 million was cut from local authorities year on year. If you want to really do something about this, you should come back in here in a month and say problem solved, money given, job done. In relation to NAMA, and I heard you discussing it, the dividend from NAMA has been nothing short of useless. The dividend from NAMA, I'll tell you about the dividend from NAMA. Your line Minister for Finance and your government, of which you have collective responsibility, the same as everybody else around the table, has forced NAMA into a quicker, faster wind down. 11,000 residential units with full planning permission were sold in this capital city this year by NAMA to private developers in job lots. What does that say about a social dividend from NAMA? What does that say about a social conscience of this government or anybody within it? It leaves a lot to be desired, that's what it does. And to talk now about what NAMA can do and what it can't do, I'll tell you what it's doing. It's lending to private developers whom are on their books to the tune of 4%. And you talked there within your speech as well about the great thing that you've done in putting forward funding of 500 million made up of 375 of our own fund, of the National Pension Reserve, and 125 from a hedge fund in the US of A. Now they're coming in to piggyback the profits that can be made as well. Because you know what? You fail to say what rate they'll be charging. 14 to 16%. While NAMA are charging 4%, an arm of the state. And this government is borrowing on a daily basis to meet the demands of services and public services at 1%. And you think you've all the answers and you've the solutions, and you think that the private sector is going to help and assist you. And of course it's a dirty word for somebody in my party to talk about what the building sector can do for this economy. Of course it is. 5 years later you think you can win an election in six months' time or 6 weeks' time over what happened 5 years ago. I'm afraid that ain't going to wash with the public. If you want to do something serious in relation to private supply, you looked at the licence and hotel trade, and I commended it for you when you brought VAT from 13% to 9%, and it had the desired effect. Well, listen to that sector has asked you to do something similar in the building sector. Look at the development levies which do not meet the market conditions today. Instruct local authorities to reduce them to levels that are compatible and to allow builders to compete. Builders to compete with the NAMA rates of 4%, because the banks aren't lending. They've let you down again, and you didn't let them down when you allowed a process by which many more people could be dumped into a homelessness situation, many more people could be thrown into overhyped rent rates, because you gave the bank a veto and you allowed that to proceed for the last 2 years. And even last week, I'm told, despite the fact that this legislature passed legislation, amended the insolvency legislation, and eventually took heed of what has been said to you, but not only by me and others, but by outside experts, that you should allow the courts at least the option of adjudicating on decisions of banks in relation to their decisions to refuse resolutions put forward by distressed mortgagers. So we went away for the summer thinking at least that's there. I'm told last week by the court services that they're not in a position to adjudicate independently because the rules within the court system haven't been amended. Who's responsible for that? Is it you? Is it the Minister for Finance? Is it the Minister for Justice? It's the coalition government. It's every single member of it. Every single member of it, of the parties that are party to it. because they too are receiving representations in their clinics, I've no doubt, from people who are in distressed situations. And the one amendment that you were 2.5 years late in bringing forward is not enacted, despite the fact that this Dáil passed that legislation.
Thank you, Deputy Cowen.
That's an absolute and total disgrace, and I want an answer to it in the context of this debate before this debate concludes. And I again ask you to please allow for a reasonable time of debate to deal with this issue, to deal with concrete proposals from my colleagues beside me here, from my colleagues there, and maybe even your own members of your parties.
Thank you, Deputy.
Because as I said to you, if I'm receiving if one and two of my representations are in relation to housing,
Deputy,
it's the same throughout the country.